This podcast is brought to you by the Maryland State Library Agency. The MSLA podcast features presenters from statewide youth programs, as well as learning opportunities for library staff and resources for patrons of the Maryland State Library for the Blind and Print Disabled.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our LBPD live author visit. I'm so excited that we have Leonard Atkins here tonight. He's known as the Habitual Hiker. He's an avid adventurer who has trekked over 20,000 miles across the backcountry regions of the U.S., Canada, Europe, and the Caribbean, with 5 full-length hikes of the Appalachian Trail. He's traveled the Continental Divide, the Pacific Northwest Trail, and parts of Canada's Great Divide Trail. He lists those among his achievements. He's a seasoned explorer. His writings and photographs have graced numerous publications, and he's the author of over 20 books on the outdoors, travel, and nature. Atkins writes about his experience and actively participates in them, meticulously measuring trails for accuracy in his guides and visiting all locations he describes in his travel books. Beyond his literary pursuits, he's contributed significantly to outdoor education and conservation efforts, serving in various capacities such as Ridge Runner, Appalachian Trail Natural Heritage Monitor, and a presenter of multimedia programs. Atkins' presentations captivate audiences with tales of his adventure, highlighting the profound connection between humanity and the natural world experienced through foot travel. Welcome, Mr. Atkins.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Ashley, and I certainly appreciate you inviting me for the program this evening. And I want to welcome everybody that's listening in. I will start out with assuming that everyone listening to the program this evening has some idea of what the Appalachian Trail is. And the reason why I say that is that means all of you know more than I did when a friend came up to me quite a number of years ago now and said, let's go hike the Appalachian Trail together. And I said, okay, what is it? I had never heard of the Appalachian Trail at that time. They gave me a 2-volume set of books of different people who had hiked the entire Appalachian Trail as a through hike. And in reading those 2 books, it seemed like everybody was having a good time. And I decided that was something that I would like to do. So I went to my boss who I was working for at the time and told him what I wanted to do and asked for a 6-month leave of absence. Amazingly, he said, well, that sounds like a good thing. Okay, you have 6 months off. So as time went on, I tried to save money. I started buying little bits and pieces of equipment as I could from my local backpacking store. And just about a month before we were supposed to start the trip, it hit me that I had never been hiking a day in my life. And I decided that I better go find out what backpacking is all about. So I'm originally from West Virginia. I drove to the highest point in the state, Spruce Knob. I parked my car on top of the mountain and I walked 2 miles out what I have since come to call a tourist trail, because even though it was on the ridge top, whoever built that trail, if there was a little knob, they went around it. If the trail dipped a little bit, they filled it in. So not only was it perfectly flat for 2 miles, but it was about 2 to 3 inches deep in bark chips. So I went out and hiked those 2 miles, nice, flat, easy, soft 2 miles, spent the night in my tent and walked those 2 miles back. When I got back, I thought, wow, if that's what hiking's all about, 2,000 miles is going to be a piece of cake. Obviously, I was in for a rude awakening when I went down to Georgia and started hiking those mountains. Just about 2 weeks before we were supposed to start the trip, the person that instigated the trip backed out on me. And I thought, well, I have the time, I have the money, I have the equipment. I'm going to go down to Georgia and start hiking northward myself. Of course, if you're hiking through hiking season on the Appalachian Trail, you're not hiking by yourself. I may have been hiking during the day, but each evening, of course, I was spending time with people at either the campsite or at a shelter along the trail. That year, I had some really good times. I had some bad times. I had some funny times, but mostly through inexperience, I only accomplished 900 miles that year. I went home thinking, well, that was great. I had a good time. That was my summer of freedom that we're all allowed to have in our lives to go and play. But it's kind of time to get serious about work and retirement funds and all that kind of stuff. And so I went back to work. Everything was okay until it was late winter. And then in my mind, I started seeing the places I had seen and the people I'd met, and I had the strong urge to go back and finish what I had started. So I went to my boss, asked for a 6 month leave of absence. Amazingly, he said, well, something's happening in 5 months. I need to have you back by then. And I thought, well, I only have 1,200 miles to do, so I can easily accomplish that in 5 months. Went back to where I had stopped hiking, continued northward, and finished the trail that year, my first complete hike of the trail. Went back to work, again thinking, got to think about career advancement and all that kind of stuff. Everything was okay until it was a beautiful late winter day. The sky was a deep blue, birds were singing, little puffy clouds were floating by. And when I walked into the building that I worked in, which had absolutely no windows in it, when the door closed behind me, it sounded like, in the movies when they throw someone in jail and the door slams behind them and it goes clang, clang, clang. That's what it felt like. I felt like I was in prison, and I thought, I need to go back down to Georgia and start hiking northward. Went to my boss, asked for a 6 month leave of absence. He said, no way. I said, good, I quit. And within 2 weeks, I was down in Georgia hiking northward again by myself. 10 days into that trip, I met Laurie, who was hiking the trail by herself. This was her first attempt at a through hike. She and I ended up having the same hiking pace together. And again, we weren't necessarily hiking with each other during the day, but we would end up at the same campsite, same shelters with other people each evening. And as they say, one thing led to another, and she and I ended up hiking all the way to Maine together. We finished that trip 5 years later. We were married at the Peaks of Otter along the Blue Ridge Parkway in Virginia. We had wanted to get married on the trail, but we had some elderly relatives that we knew couldn't get out on the trail, so we at least still had an outdoor wedding along the Blue Ridge Parkway. Laurie turned out to be even more of a hiking fanatic than I am. And since that time, she and I have both hiked the Appalachian Trail. I have now done it 5 times. She actually is out hiking right now, and she will finish in about a month. That will be her 5th complete time on the Appalachian Trail. So we both hiked it 5 times. I lack about 600 miles of finishing it for a 6th time. And as Ashley said, Laurie and I have also hiked a bunch of other long distance trails, the 1,100 mile Pacific Northwest Trail through Montana, Idaho, and Washington, the Continental Divide Trail along the crest of the Rocky Mountains from Canada to Mexico, several hundred miles on the Great Divide in Canada. We've walked the full length of the Pyrenees along the border of France and Spain. One year we did an exploration of the interior of Iceland. Another year we went to New Zealand and hiked a number of their long distance trails. So altogether, as Ashley said, about 20,000 miles of long distance hiking for me. So that's your introduction to me and how I guess came to be talking to you this evening. To give you a little bit of history about the Appalachian Trail so you can know what we're talking about. The trail goes through 14 different states here in the eastern United States. It passes through 6 national parks and 8 national forests. Elevations range from near sea level in New York to over 6,000 feet in elevation in Tennessee. The idea of the Appalachian Trail is pretty much credited to Benton MacKaye, who in 1921 wrote an article talking about a long distance trail along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains here in the eastern United States. And he was what I think was a pretty far-sighted guy, because he said in that article, he said that in the America of the future, and of course, you and I are the future he was talking about. He said, in the America of the future, the Eastern United States is going to be basically one big city from Boston to Atlanta. And he certainly turned out to be right. Uh, so his words must have struck a chord because uh, he wrote that article in 1921 and 1923. The first few miles of trail built specifically for the Appalachian Trail were opened in Bear Mountain and Harriman State Parks in New York. And just 2 years after that, in 1925, the Appalachian Trail Conference was formed. Now, recently, the Trail Conference changed its name to the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. So if I forget and call it the conference, please remember that today it's actually called the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, or as most people just call it, the ATC, Appalachian Trail Conservancy. So the first few miles of trail were built in 1923. And amazingly, in just 14 years later, in 1937, the trail was completed as a 2,000-mile trail all the way from Georgia to Maine. Lots of times people ask me when they hear how many times I've hiked the trail, what I think is the most beautiful or my favorite part of the trail. And I kind of turn their question around and say, to me, the most beautiful aspect of the trail is that it was and is still almost exclusively planned, built, and maintained almost 100% by volunteers. That means that people like you and me are willing to go out and do what pretty much which is backbreaking work, just so that you and I can go out and take a walk in the woods. Again, like I say, only 14 years. In today's modern world with heavy earth moving equipment, we can't get roads built in 14 years. And these people went out with just hand tools, picks, axes, shovels, rakes, and built the trail across the mountains in just 14 years. So the trail was completed in 1937. Of course, America's interests were elsewhere during World War II, and the trail kind of fell in disrepair during the war. In 1948, Earl Schaefer, who lived in central Pennsylvania, decided that he wanted to go out and hike the entire Appalachian Trail all in one hiking season. Now, Earl knew that he might be the first person to accomplish this, but he didn't really gather any fame. He did it, as he wrote in his book that he later wrote, he did it to, quote, walk the army out of my system. So he went out, he hiked the trail. 4.5 months later, from when he started in Georgia, he finished in Maine. He went to the Appalachian Trail Conference and told them, I've just hiked the entire Appalachian Trail in one hiking season. They basically called him a liar. They said this is physically impossible for anyone to do this. Luckily, Earl had kept a very detailed journal, and he had taken what were evidently hundreds and maybe even thousands of slides. And he spent about 2 weeks at the Appalachian Trail Conference, and they admitted, well, okay, you are the first person to hike the entire Appalachian Trail in one hiking season. Of course, the term through hiker did not exist at that time, but Earl became the first Appalachian Trail through hiker. Several years later, he became the first person to hike the trail going northward. He went to Georgia a few years later, Maine, and hiked Georgia, becoming the first person to hike it in both directions. And on the 50th anniversary of his original through hike in 1998, he went out and hiked the trail again from Georgia to Maine. So, and he turned 80 just 2 years after he finished that, 2 weeks after he finished that hike. So never let anyone tell you you're too old to go do something. So the reason why I tell you about Earl's hike is that to show you how numbers of people have increased while hiking the Appalachian Trail. Earl completed that hike. He was the first person in 1948. When I reported to the Appalachian Trail Conference that I had hiked the entire trail in the early 1980s, they told me that I was the 998th person to hike the entire trail. So from 1948 to the early 80s, less than 1,000 people hiked the entire trail. Today, I was looking at the Appalachian Trail Conservancy's website, and they say more than 21,000 people have now reported hiking the Appalachian Trail. So we can see how the numbers have really increased. One of the other things about the trail is the trail that Earl hiked in the early 1980s and in 1948, and I hiked in the early 1980s, is a much different trail than the trail that you and I and other people hike today. When the trail was originally built, the planners of that trail got permission from many, many private landowners for the trail to go through their private property. Of course, as time went on, those landowners passed away, or the land was passed on to other people. And in the late 50s and early 60s, America really started changing. That's when we started moving out to suburbs, and housing development started getting the Appalachian Trail kicked off these private lands. And in order to keep the trail a continuous pathway, volunteers were going out and having to blaze just roadways for people to keep it a continuous trail. When I first hiked the trail in the early 1980s, I would say that 300 to 400 miles of that trail was on road walk. Recognizing what was happening, volunteers started lobbying Congress, and in 1968, President Lyndon Johnson signed the first National Scenic Trails Act, which named our first two National Scenic Trails, the Appalachian Trail here in the east and the Pacific Crest Trail on the west coast. It named those trails, but it really didn't give any money, so the trail kept on getting displaced. Luckily, in 1978, we got an amendment to that, and President Jimmy Carter signed an amendment to the National Trail System Act, and that provided money to start purchasing land for the trail. And I'm happy to say that we are within like 1.5% of the entire trail not being protected. So we have 98.5% of the 2,000-mile trail all on public lands. So my association with the trail, as Ashley said, I've become, I was a ridge runner for a while, meaning we go out and walk the trail and help people who may be having problems, need water or something. But we were also there to educate people on how to hike safely, how to treat the environment, so that there's not a detriment to it. And with so many people out there hiking the trail these days, the need to protect the trail and to hike in a different way than we did in the early days is there. I've also been on a couple of boards of the Appalachia local trail maintaining clubs. So anyway, even though there are that many people out there, it's still a place, it's still a wonderful place where you can go out and spend quiet time in the company of just a few fellow companions. It's a place to appreciate the earth. It's a place to still listen to the sound of the wind through the trees. You can smell the woods as the summer rain washes over it. These are things that I was trying to think about to describe what it's like to hike the trail. And one of the things that people ask me about hiking the trail is what is the hardest part of it? And I will say that the Appalachian Trail, of all the trails I've hiked, the Continental Divide Trail, the Pyrenees in Europe, of all those trails, the Appalachian Trail is by far the most physically demanding of all those trails. You would think that the mountains in the east are certainly not as tall as the Rocky Mountains in the west, but when the trails go up, the other trails in other parts of the country, they're built lots of times with horse packers in mind. So the trails kind of meander up the mountains. Where on the AT, the trails have a tendency, yes, we have switchbacks, but they're built at a steeper grade. So the AT is much more physically demanding. But what I found and what Laurie and I found is when we're planning a long distance hike, we never planned more than 8 miles a day for the first 2 weeks. And that's just to get us kind of in shape. And we find that most people, if you can stick it out for the first 2, 3, 4 weeks, after a while, your body is going to get in shape. And it never gets easy. I don't want to say it ever gets easy, but your body gets into shape. But the thing that I find, and what most people find, that keeps people from completing entire length of the entire length of the Appalachian Trail is it's more mentally challenging than it is physical. And what I mean by that is there was one year when we were hiking and it rained for 28 straight days in a row. Now, I don't mean that it rained on us every minute for 28 straight days, but sometime during those 28 days, sometime each day we got wet. It rained on us, and to go to sleep at night and crawl into that damp sleeping bag and then get up the next morning and put on those same wet socks and those same wet shoes and those same wet boots, and then take the tent down in the rain and walk all day long in the rain. That's what defeats people. Walking through the heat, bugs, mosquitoes, black flies, those kind of things. That's what defeats people. But what keeps you going is the beauty of the woods, that you're out there. Like I say, there to be able to listen to the birds singing, to wake up on a morning when you wake up and the sun is coming out and the tent starts to brighten and you can feel the warmth and you can hear that chorus of birds waking you up, and to put that pack on and to get out and walk on that cool, crisp morning. That's what keeps you going. And also the trail, the Appalachian Trail, I'm not the first person to say this, but the Appalachian Trail is almost more of a social hike than it is a hike in the woods, because so many people are hiking on the Appalachian Trail that you just, every evening you're with people, you're experiencing the same thing, you're cold together, you're hot together, you're having this elation of seeing a beautiful sunrise or a great view. So you just become fast friends with people. And one of the things that I always liked about the trail was it was just interesting. You'd hike with someone for 2, 3, 4 weeks, and then all of a sudden, for some reason, maybe you went into a town to resupply, and they did not, and they kept on going. And that maybe happened in, say, North Carolina, Tennessee. And then 3 months later, you're walking down the trail, and all of a sudden, there's this person sitting next to the trail, and there's your long lost friend again. So it's just that great companionship that is on the trail. And there's a book that I wanted to read an excerpt from that just describes this companionship that you get from the trail. It's a book by David Brill called As Far as the Eye Can See. He hiked the trail in the late 1970s. And even though he hiked the trail that long ago, his observations are still very valid. And he has a great thing to say about the trail community. And like I said, this is David Brill in the book As Far as the Eye Can See. And he said, whatever concerns I had about this trail lacking union companionship were resolved this evening. There are 19 hikers and 2 dogs wedged into the shelter. Further cramping our space are hikers' packs and food bags, which hang like ripe fruit from the rafters to keep them from the mice, rats, and skunks who also call this place home. There are hikers here from Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Tennessee, North Carolina, Massachusetts, Virginia, and Georgia. And though we all have different backgrounds and come from different parts of the country, we are unified by our shared love for the wilderness. Here are 19 strangers existing so peaceably, sharing food, thoughts, equipment, and trail tips under conditions that would pitch most city dwellers into panic. What is it about our society that inhibits such wonderful and spontaneous acceptance and sense of community? To me, he just captures the essence of what it is to be an Appalachian Trail through hiker while you're on the Appalachian Trail. One of the other things about the trail that I want to mention is you're not just hiking in the woods, you're obviously experiencing the America of today because you're going into towns to resupply. So you're meeting people in towns. You're seeing what American culture is like, but you're also, the trail just really passes through a lot of American history. And some of the examples I was thinking of were in central Pennsylvania. You pass through coal mining areas that were at one time big boom areas. And if you live in the mid-Atlantic states, you know the boom and bust cycles of coal mining. So we go through these areas that at one time were thriving communities that were more than 1,000 people. Yet the only thing that reminds us that were people there is maybe a small cemetery, or there's an old railroad grade that the trail makes use of for quite a number of miles. A short distance later, we walked through Pine Grove Furnace State Park, and the furnace produced arms for the Revolutionary War. Passing from Maryland into Pennsylvania, we crossed the Mason-Dixon line. And of course, that was surveyed by Mason and Dixon in 1765 to settle the dispute between Pennsylvania and Maryland as to where the actual border of the trail was. And in Maryland, I know some of you were virtually hiking the 40 miles of the trail in Western Maryland, and you pass through a lot of history on the crest of the South Mountain. During the French and Indian War in 1755, British troops, which at that time included a young George Washington, built a wagon road through Turner's Gap, and that road eventually became our first national road. It is now US 40 passing through Western Maryland. And speaking of George Washington, I never knew this, and we certainly didn't learn this in school, but did you know that the first original monument to George Washington was built on South Mountain near Boonesboro in the early 1820s by the citizens of that as a monument to him? And the Civil War, there were quite a number of Civil War battles along the South Mountain. So all of these things, again, we walk a part of the C&O Canal near the West Virginia-Maryland border. We go into Harper's Ferry, which everyone knows was the site of the John Brown's raid on the arsenal. So altogether, it's not just a walk in the woods. It's a walk with social aspects, and it's a walk through the history of America. And I know we're right at about 30 minutes, I think, Ashley. So there, I know I've talked a lot about my experiences, but I did want to read what I used to give programs for Road Scholar. I don't know if any of you know about Road Scholar. It's a program where people come and spend a week learning about certain subjects. And one of the things I did is I had a segment that I called The Literature of the Appalachian Trail. And I think that just as much as I have my experiences, a lot of other people can shed really good light on what it's like to hike the Appalachian Trail. So there's 3 books that I'd like to read from to just give you a little bit more understanding of the trail. And the first one is from Earl Schaefer's book, The Man Who First Hiked the Entire Appalachian Trail back in 1948. The book is called Walking with Spring. And besides being a hiker, Earl was a very diverse man. He was a songwriter. He was a poet. He lived very simply, even back in the 40s and 50s. He lived in a house that had no electricity, no running water. So he was a very a simple man, but also a very good thinker. And this excerpt from the book is from his last day as he's hiking Mount Katahdin, the northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. So this is Earl Schaefer. Another mile and the long cruise would be over. I almost wish that the trail was endless, that no one could ever hike its full length. Perhaps in the future it would extend in a giant loop by way of the Alleghenies to make it a truly endless trail, more than twice as long. My thoughts were of many places, of memories that would never fade. But time cannot stand still. Like a ship that comes to the quay, its sails furled or its engines quiet, drifting with the impetus of a long voyage, I moved across the tableland. Midway is the solitary Thoreau Spring, discovered on one of the first ascents of Katahdin by Henry David Thoreau. Step by step across the rocks, the lone trail hiker came to the cairn on Baxter's Peak, said to be the first spot in the United States to be touched by the rays of the rising sun. My little black journal says, reached the summit about 1:30. The long cruise was finished. Already it seemed like a vivid dream, through sunshine, shadow, and rain. Already I knew that many times I would want to be back again on the cloud-high hills where the whole world lies below and far away, by the wind-worn cairn where admiring eyes first welcome newborn day, to walk once more where the white clouds sail, far from the city clutter, and drink a toast to the lone high trail in clear, cold mountain water. To me, that's poetry right there in his prose. Just a great thing. Another book is by Cindy Ross. It is her I Hiked the Appalachian Trail book. Her book is a little interesting in that she includes sketches that she included in her journal as she was hiking the trail. And there's a little segment that I wanted to read that kind of describes just a day in the life of a hiker and why you're out there and how your emotions are kind of on a roller coaster. Soon the rain creeps into every corner of my body. It runs in streams down my poncho, onto my legs, saturates my socks, and collects in my boots, and collects until I'm working on sponges and water squirts out of the pores of my leather, and I must stop every 15 minutes to wring my socks out. My nose runs constantly. My hair is plastered to my face. There's dirt everywhere on me. I'm cold, I'm wet, I'm numb and hungry because I can't stop to eat or rest, or I'll freeze, and all I can think of is home. But something must be said for the joys of rain. On those unearthly mornings when I awake and the land is swimming in a warm, misty, opaque fog, moisture hangs on to everything, every leaf, every branch, every dust particle in the atmosphere. It holds it there until it can't hold it anymore and lets go drop by drop, clinging to my eyelashes, thickening my hair, moistening my skin. And I'm glad I'm alive and moving through it. Just to me, again, a wonderful example of the highs and lows that you do. And then I'd like to go back to David Brill, and as far as the eye can see. And he's writing, I'm lying under a wind and rain buffeted tarp in a mountain gap in Georgia. I can hear wind gusts miles away and then gather intensity and plow through the gap. And with each gust, the tarp sounds as if it's about to break its tethers. The trees creak and I can hear limbs crack. I'm terrified and awed by the power and violence of nature, and I realize that there's nowhere I can go to escape it. I never fully appreciated how vulnerable I'd feel away from the shelter of a roof and four sound walls. There was, however, one thing I knew for certain that night. I was frightened. And one of the reasons I read that book, read that segment, is because it relates to something that Laurie told me after we had met. If you remember, I said she was hiking for about 10 days by herself. And she told me that she was climbing to the highest point in Georgia, Blood Mountain, and she realized she wasn't going to make it to the top of the mountain before nightfall. So she found a nice place to camp. And as she was setting up the tent, the weather changed. A severe storm blew in, the wind picked up, lightning and hail started falling, and the wind was so bad that the trees were, if you've ever been out in a bad storm where the limbs of the trees are knocking against each other. She said she was sitting in the tent and didn't know whether she should get out of the tent in case a limb broke off a tree, or she should stay in the security of the tent. So she said she remembered that her mother had given her a little pocket Bible to take with her as she was hiking the trail. And she said, I know, I'll just open it up and randomly read some words of comfort. And these are the words she read when she opened the Bible. And he shall cast you from your tent, and you will no longer dwell in the land of the living. That's what she wrote. That's what she read. And she said she put the Bible aside and left it as shelter for somebody else to take along with her. The final one I'd like to read from you is from my book. It's called Nature of the Appalachian Trail, and this is from the introduction. And it says, I have now hiked more than 20,000 miles in the United States, in Canada, Europe, and New Zealand. And I've now topped the steaming volcanoes of the Caribbean, looked down upon Europe from the crest of the Alps, and crisscrossed the border of France and Spain along the full length of the Pyrenees. And yet the Appalachians, my native mountains, continue to draw me back. I've now hiked the Appalachian Trail in its entirety in 5 times, and I'm now within 600 miles of finishing it for a 6th. While there is no doubt that I enjoy the grandeur of scenery from the higher altitudes of other mountain ranges of the world, I find that the pointed spires of the rough and rocky ridgelines appear like upraised arms of adversary, calling me out on a dare to test my mettle, to see if I can survive their soaring elevations or ferocious weather. On the other hand, even though the Appalachian Trail is more physically challenging than any other trail I have hiked, the softer eroded lines of its mountains, with their gradually descending spur ridges covered in lush vegetation, suggest a compassionate and kindly mother wanting to encircle me and welcome me with arms cloaked in a shawl of green, reassuring me that everything will be all right. And I hope that sums up my feelings of the Appalachian Trail and the Appalachian Mountains. And I hope that's what you'll experience when you're out there. And I think we have some time for some questions and answers.
We certainly do.
I hope someone has some.
Well, I'll get us started with a simple question. What essential gear should every hiker carry, regardless of the difficulty of the trail?
Well, whether you're hiking of course, there are things to have on an overnight hike that you certainly don't need on a day hike. But on every pack, whether you're on a day hike or an overnight hike, of course, carry enough water with you. There are water sources along the trail, but they should not be trusted to be potable to drink. So you should carry some kind of water filter or purifier if you don't have enough water with you. You should always have some kind of rain gear, some kind of warm layer. In the mountains, even if you're out on the hottest of days, I have seen, even in the mid-Atlantic, hiking in Maryland and Virginia, a day that starts out 80, 90 degrees. If you're up at 4,000 feet in elevation and a storm rolls in, we can get down into the 60s and 50s and maybe even the 40s. And that's when, especially if you're wet and the cold temperature rolls in, that's when hypothermia will strike. So always make sure you have something like rain gear and some warm layer of clothing. Flashlight, of course, in case you're out after dark. And I am a big proponent of carrying a map and compass. The Appalachian Trail Conservancy always has Appalachian Trail guides that you can purchase. There are even some now applications for phones that you can put on to help you find out where you are. So those are certainly the minimum that I would take with me on a day hike. Hope that answers your question.
It does.
Some other things, like say, of course, you should always let someone know where you are, where you're going to hike, just in case you don't show up at the time that you're supposed to. Having said that, I am very comfortable hiking by myself. I'm very comfortable letting Laurie hike by herself, but that's because I feel we're pretty experienced. One of the other things, and I forgot to mention, of course, is a first aid kit that you should take along with you. But more than that, take your brain along with you. Don't do foolish things. And the best first aid kit you can take with you is to take a wilderness first aid training course. Because when you're out there, yes, there are other people out there, but it's pretty much you have to depend on. So make sure you know how to take care of yourself.
All right. I'm going to open the floor up for any questions.
Okay. One of the other things that I know, I didn't talk about it, but in doing some research for this particular program, I did a Google search on people who've hiked the Appalachian Trail with disabilities of some kind or another. And I did know that in the mid 1980s, Bill Irwin became the first blind person to through hike the entire Appalachian Trail. And since that time, I know that there are at least two other people who are blind that have hiked the entire Appalachian Trail. And I was telling Ashley about this fellow that I had never heard of, but found on a Google search that he's blind and has hiked 20,000 miles of long distance trails. He's done the Appalachian Trail here in the East. He's done the Pacific Crest Trail and a bunch of other hikes. I hiked one year with a fellow, Bob Barker, who had multiple sclerosis, and he hiked the entire trail 3 times. Year after year, and he did it with crutches. It was amazing to watch him. There have been paraplegics and even quadriplegics who have done the entire Appalachian Trail. So it's possible, and it's amazing what the human body is capable of doing.
Well, thank you, Mr. Adkins, for being here tonight. I really appreciate it.
Well, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope everyone got something out of it. And if you would like to find out more about me, or I did write a series of articles on the last through hike that I did for a newspaper, and I put that on my website. So if you're interested, it's habitualhiker.com. That was my trail name, was Habitual Hiker. So you could go on there and read a little bit further about my exploits on the last through hike I did.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it. Thank you to everyone who attended live. And of course, if you're listening to this after the fact and you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me at the library. I'll be happy to answer them.
Okay. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Maryland State Library Agency. For links to additional resources provided by today's presenter, please visit the show notes. For more information on MSLA or the Maryland State Library for the Blind and Print Disabled, visit marylandlibraries.org.